The Latin word propaganda today has become proverbial. This word can be heard everywhere and mainly in a political context. Traditionally, it has a negative connotation, since propaganda is understood as the purposeful dissemination of conceptually alien information by ideological opponents in order to manipulate the consciousness of the mass of the society object of manipulation, perverting its worldview and world understanding, which form the basis of its historically established beliefs and convictions, recruiting agents among representatives of the society object, a kind of friend among foes, and similar evil-intentioned objectives. In modern political discourses, this is an open dissemination of all kinds of ideologies in the broadest sense of the word, with the objective of forming public opinion of a completely definite content, or other objectives pursued by propagandists. Moreover, the dissemination of ideology can be directed not only against the ideological opponents, but also within society itself. If we turn to the original language, then we will see that the word propaganda comes from Latin and literally means subject to dissemination, which in turn is derived from the Latin verb propago, I spread, I disseminate. To put it differently, proceeding from the basic meaning of the word, propaganda means that which is subject to dissemination, that is, that which should be informed in one form or another. And the multifacetedness of life is such that information of different types is subject to dissemination, and not just of a political nature, as has been historically assigned to this word. In other words, proceeding from the original meaning and from the multifacetedness of life as such, this word is applicable not only to political phenomena, but also to life in the broadest sense of the word, from current short-term everyday tasks to ideologies and religions, and tasks of global politics and tasks of global level significance in general. Any type of information that is subject to dissemination in any of the spheres of human society is already propaganda. Information subject to dissemination includes both information of a direct, by announcement nature, and information of an indirect, by default nature. And these levels do not always coincide. If everything concerning information by announcement is intuitively clear, then the concept of information by default requires some explanation. The world is arranged in such a way that information objectively accompanies all processes taking place in creation, in social systems, in pan-natural phenomena. If one looks for processes in creation that flow without corresponding informational accompaniment, then, firstly, such searches will not be crowned with success. Secondly, it will turn out that it will not be possible to announce the entire completeness of the information. Something will always remain in the category of it goes without saying. Human speech and national languages which encode information inherent to a particular culture serve, when a current need arises, to convey that accompanying information in which a real need has arisen, and the relevance of which has not yet disappeared. To put it another way, a person announces information that due to the forming of circumstances according to his subjective views and according to his subjective purpose orientation, should go from the status not subject to dissemination into the status subject to dissemination. Nonetheless, regardless of announcement or non-announcement, information in the status of not subject to dissemination objectively exists and appears to be primary in relation to information subject to dissemination. Consequently, information subject to dissemination, as it were, crystallizes from information not subject to dissemination. Another facet of what has been said is concluded in the fact that fragments of informational accompaniment, that is, information not subject to dissemination, are not a random set of chaotically disconnected components, but are interconnected, interdependent, interconditioned, and mutually supplemented. Consequently, transitioning from the status of not subject to dissemination to the status of subject to dissemination, this or that fragment of the information algorithmic system does not lose its role in the holographic integrity of that information algorithmic system to which it belongs, and in the informational background, it, as it were, silently implies these interconnections, interdependencies, interconditionednesses, and mutual supplementednesses with corresponding fragments. What has been said means that it is objectively impossible to disseminate information, that is, propaganda, in such a way as not to leave something in the informational background, in the category of it goes without saying. This phenomenon is, in its essence, a fundamental principle of creation and an objective property of information within it. It is called the principle of supplementarity of information. Its essence can be illustrated in the following example. If you are told that a triangle is right-angled, then if you are familiar with the Pythagorean theorem, you understand that along with the fact that one of the corners of the triangle is 90 degrees, you are also told by default that the sum of the squares of the other two sides is equal to the square of the hypotenuse, and that a circle can be described around it, one of the diameters of which will exactly coincide with its hypotenuse. However, these announced defaults of the original message are not your or our personal self-inventions, but a consequence of the objective laws of mathematics. The question arises, is mathematics the only sphere where the principle of supplementarity of information operates, or does it operate in the entire creation, and therefore in all spheres without exception? The answer is obvious. Objective laws operate not only in mathematics. Therefore, through any message and through any dissemination of information, that is, propaganda, knowing the corresponding objective laws, one can reach that objective information, which sometimes even against the wishes of the disseminator, and sometimes due to his malicious intent, accompanies the message, while remaining in the defaults. That is, information remains in the status of not subject to dissemination, not subject to direct announcement. However, it remains interconnected, interdependent, interconditioned, and mutually supplementary in relation to the information that has transitioned from the status of not subject to dissemination into the status of subject to dissemination. Consequently, in a particular information algorithmic system, information by default may supplement information by announcement. Information by default may contradict information by announcement. Information by default with some fragments may supplement information by announcement, and with some fragments contradict it. Furthermore, a disseminator of any information, that is, a propagandist, may not know the objective, that is, real, regardless of his subjective views, if any, ratio of information by announcement and by default of the propaganda to which he is committed, or in the dissemination of which for one reason or another he participates. May know this objective ratio, may partly know this objective ratio. According to the principle, everyone within the measure of his understanding works for himself, and within the measure of his non-understanding he works for those who know and understand more. When two propagandas, propaganda A and propaganda B, collide, the matrix of their interactions can be as follows. Propaganda A coincides with propaganda B, both at the level of defaults and at the level of announcements. The differences are only in form, but not in content. Propaganda A does not coincide with propaganda B at the level of defaults, but coincides with it at the level of announcements. Propaganda A does not coincide with propaganda B at the level of announcements, but it does coincide with it at the level of defaults. Variance combined of two or three named interactions in a certain proportionality and hierarchical inorderliness of fragments of both propagandas. And if a person is a carrier of a certain information algorithmic support, i.e., psyche, then he is already a carrier of this or that information algorithmic system, and is therefore an exponent of its level of announcements and defaults, including their unique ratio. What has been said means that there is not a single person who is free from any kind of propaganda, Moreover, such a person simply cannot exist, at the least because he is part of society in which certain information is always disseminated, spread, propagandized. In this sense, propagandists, regardless of the content of the information they propagandize, regardless of their conceptual ideological orientation, turn out to be journalists, writers, teachers, politicians, film directors, theater directors, actors, artists, musicians, priests, gurus, and other disseminators of information. Accordingly, if there are mass media and television in a country, books are written and published, domestic films are made and foreign films are imported, theatrical and musical art develops, and so on, then in the country there is also a specific propaganda, characterized by the content, the measure of aggressiveness, the measure of implicit or explicit anti-humanness, both in relation to unwanted friends and in relation to foes. The quality and quantity of internal antagonisms, the influence in foreign countries, and so on, as well as by the attitude towards Soviet shame, willpower, and intellectual creative potential of the individual. And unlike objective information in creation, which is always internally harmonious, any propaganda in human society can objectively consist of truth, that is, an adequate description of some objective phenomena, mistakes, sincere delusions, lies, including deliberate lies, embedded in a propaganda for specific purposes, and a volume multi-measured combination of the named components. In any propaganda, one can find purpose orientation, distinguish between the levels of defaults and the level of announcements, and reveal the difference, if any, of their purpose orientation. However, since any propaganda is a subjective description of some objective phenomena, then there is practically no such information algorithmic system or propaganda that does not contain the truth at all. A propaganda can objectively contain 80% of the truth, regardless of the opinion about this truth of its adherents and opponents, or it may contain less than 1% of the truth. It all depends on the propaganda itself and the objectives for which it works. There is no propaganda without any certain purpose orientation, even if at first glance it may not be obvious, may not be directly announced, or it may be simply announced that it does not exist. No matter what, a person should have freedom in the search for the truth as it really is, always situationally, ultimately concrete and determined, but not abstract, unambiguous of the type, propaganda A is definitely good and right, and propaganda B is definitely bad and wrong. My opinion is definitely good and right, and a different opinion is definitely bad and wrong. Living on the basis of the principle of a constant, sincere search for the truth as it really is, and not being afraid to reveal its essence, is not the principle that the majority live by. After all, it's easier to engage in abstract leisure, sometimes emotionally excited reasoning on the theme of propaganda A is definitely good, but propaganda B is definitely bad. For this reason, all those who belong to propaganda B are definitely lost, and therefore are foes of those who belong to propaganda A, which is unambiguously right and true. So we, adherents of the correct propaganda A, will in every possible way oppose all those who belong to faux propaganda B, by all possible and available means. The named principle is the path to permanent confrontation that requires specific resources which can be applied for better purposes, and often requires human victims. In other words, this is the path to the death of civilization. Nevertheless, it is foolish to be afraid of someone else's propaganda. This is equivalent to being afraid of other opinions. In addition to the fact that carriers of such a position, by default, imply their own arrogant, unconditional impeccability and superiority over the carriers of other views, which are often declared, even by announcement, as a priori foes, threatening to violate the impeccability of this position, they forget, and often simply do not know, that in each propaganda there are some grains of truth, scattered within it like beads, and the only question is how many such beads in percentage ratio are in one or the other propaganda. and it is far from a fact that there are more beads in one's own propaganda than in the one that is declared hostile and threatening. One should not be afraid of other people's opinions, both of a daily, everyday nature and of a global, political, ideological, and confessional religious nature. One should work with other views. And the only constructive approach to this work is to honestly answer the question, what is the interlocutor right about? Or, where lies the truth in another's opinion, a particular position of this or that propaganda? Questions like, what is the interlocutor wrong about? Or, where lies the untruth in another's opinion? Are purely destructive in nature, since they keep information in the defaults, according to which the person answering these questions remains impeccable. Another destructive approach is the position, I do not believe anyone or anything. Moreover, adherents of propaganda A often call adherents of propaganda B, as well as jumpers from propaganda A to propaganda B, brainwashed. At the same time, they themselves express fear of being brainwashed by propaganda B. However, adherents of propaganda A, who are afraid of being brainwashed by propaganda B, which they perceive to be alien, foe, or hostile, forget that they themselves are simply carriers of some other propaganda, propaganda A, which has already made them brainwashed in its own way. It is far from a fact that being brainwashed by propaganda A is better and safer than being brainwashed by propaganda B. The developed personal, cognitive, creative potential is not afraid of any propaganda and is not brainwashed by either of them, but works essentially with all information by collecting beads. This means those who are not afraid of any propaganda are those who, using their intellectual, creative, and intuitive dialectical potential for the intended purpose, have outgrown the propaganda under the power of which they grew up and developed personally psychically, having taken the best from it, and sincerely seek the truth as it really is. Those who are afraid of any propaganda are those who, without using their intellectual, creative, and intuitive dialectical potential for the intended purpose, are tied to the propaganda under the power of which they grew up and developed personally psychically, having absorbed mistakes from it and lies, including a priori lies first of all. And as the devil shies away from incense, they shy away from the truth as it really is, and other views that do not coincide with their own.